This week, the co-owners of two local community newspapers, Bay Windows and the South End News, have announced they are up for sale. Bay Windows has served the LGBTQ community since its launch in the early 80s. Co-owner Sue O'Connell says over the decades, the paper's mission has changed dramatically, but it's still a necessary service.
What has changed about the content of your newspapers, but especially Bay Windows, in the last couple of decades?
Some of the first issues contained profiles of couples who had been together for a very long time and who were hoping they could marry someday, and how Dorchester is becoming gay. And those are the same stories that we're working on today, but we've kind of turned to a more columnist point of view at Bay Windows rather than doing news coverage.
And O'Connell says just as the push for same-sex marriage began, so did the realization that the gay community was just like everyone else.
It was actually my business partner's idea. He realized that there was this thing called gay sprawl happening, right? So what we started doing was distributing the newspapers in supermarkets, which allowed those LGBTQ people who weren't going to nightclubs and bars in Boston anymore because they're having kids and we're worried about the PTA, could get the paper.
The paper faced tough times, too. Anti-gay advocacy groups took them on.
We were one of the first LGBTQ papers to have newspaper boxes all around the state. Someone kept putting a dead pigeon, taking the papers and putting a dead pigeon in.
As for the decision to sell, O'Connell and partner Jeff Coakley say they are just too busy to continue and hope civic-minded buyers step up.
You know, I mean, it's both been a passion for Jeff and I. We've always kind of joked that we were professionally gay, but it's been a joy, and we want to pass it along in good health so someone can take it on to the next generation.
Let's hope.
Lylah, it's interesting what Sue says about turning to columnists, because it's true. I mean, during the 80s, Bay Windows drove a lot of coverage, AIDS stories. And then there was these stories about these anti-gay advocates, like she mentioned the thing about the pigeons, but there was also a guy and a woman who used to go into the stores, grab all the newspapers and take them home, like 200-300 at a time, so they couldn't be distributed. So they've come through a lot of mutations.
They really have. And I think their switch to a more columnist format is an acknowledgement that times have changed. It's no longer news, really, necessarily, that there are gay people living next door to you. It's no longer news that there are couples who have been in love for decades who are now finally able to get married. I think that the shift in the way consumers consume news also has something to do with it. You're no longer competing with other publications or necessarily filling gaps that other publications haven't filled. It's mainstream now. So what you're competing with are people's time and their attention. It's the eyeballs issue, I think. You also have a generational shift happening. You've got a rising generation of people like Jojo Siwa, other people who are in entertainment who are proudly out and not ashamed of it, not hiding it. And the reaction from the general public, yes, they're the people who are outraged, but overall, people just embrace it now. It's just part of how things are. And I think that's part of the reason why just the way the news has shifted.
Yeah, first of all, congratulations are in order to Sue and Jeff for the fantastic job they've done over the years. That's hard work. And in an era when other locally based newspapers are dropping like flies, they're a real good role model for how to hang in there. We're lucky here in Boston. We have those papers. The Dorchester Reporter comes to mind as a community newspaper that does excellent work. There are other niche publications that have risen up. And I think this speaks to sort of the rough future, although without Dan Kennedy here to help me, I feel reluctant to wade into all this, but you've got to have a niche. You've got to fill an unmet need. And with the proliferation of national news sources and even local news sources of general interest, that means more micro, more local, more grassroots. And these two newspapers, I think, really set a good standard, along with the tab newspapers that emerged at about the same time in the mid-'80s. I think it's still a viable formula.
I would agree with Jon, and I'll channel Dan Kennedy by saying the most successful local newspapers are the ones that are hyper-local, that are really, there to bring what's happening locally, but have a particular focus. And both for the South End and Bay Windows, that's happening. I don't think that news about LGBTQ people is mainstreamed enough. I have a regular segment on my radio show, and we have quite a lot to talk about in depth, and we end up running out of time every time we get together. That's how much information is still out there to be discussed. So I think what we want to see, what I'd like to see from the great job that Jeff and Sue have done, is that some young people like they were take this over and take it to another level of how they cover the news, because there's still interest and there's still a lot to be covered locally, and there's still a lot to be covered just in the arena of LGBTQ information and news, I feel.
Yeah, and let's hope. Most of us know Sue or Jeff. Sue is a longtime former colleague at NECN. One of the things that I think Lylah mentioned earlier is so important that it's easy to forget that Bay Windows drove a lot of the coverage in other media in Boston on certain issues, particularly on gay marriage more than a decade ago. And another thing that really struck me in Sue's release, she said, when they said they were putting it up for sale, we started these papers because it would be fun. And it was. And, that's something fun in journalism you don't hear very much about anymore. So that, to me, is a little bit of a loss and something that I think that she and the two publications stood for. The other thing is who's going to buy it. I hope somebody does. Sue said, I hope it's a nonprofit conversion, government support, public and or digital media merger or community ownership. And she says, we're willing to stay on and make that happen. I just hope it does, because I think it's a hugely valuable service and an important voice.
I couldn't find out what the sale price is, but I did try.
I did try and asked Sue, is anybody, have you had any offers? If you hadn't, she wouldn't say.
I think it happened very suddenly, but I think she'll get an offer or two. That's my guess.